Just for the sake of argument, let's assume that a revived American Nazi Party wanted to set up a university, and did. They set up a university, and this university, they announced publicly, would practice and teach anti-Semitism. It would be a racist university. Or imagine the Ku Klux Klan decided to start their own university, and that their curriculum would be white supremacist and racist by definition. Now imagine if these things happened in the United States. Do you believe that the federal government should help fund the operations of these universities? Should the federal government provide student loans to students who are attending Ku Klux Klan University or the American Nazi University? Of course you would. You would say no. You might even say that's illegal under federal law to support an institution like that. And yet that's what's happening in this country today. The United States taxpayers are supporting institutions that announce publicly that they are racist. I was raised and schooled as a Roman Catholic, so I'm totally familiar with the concept of guilt. In Mass as a Catholic, you beat your chest, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. My fault, my most grievous fault. If you go back to the medieval period, dominated by the Catholic Church, you had your flagellants. These were the people who would not just walk through a town, they would walk from town to town, marching along, lamenting the sins of themselves and others, and whipping themselves, called flagellants, to flagellate, to whip, with their whips. They would, swing over their backs, they would draw blood, they would scar themselves. And this kind of thing went on in some religious orders into the 20th century. I know that on a personal level. You also had more extreme groups, especially in Russia. You had some really strange groups. You had flagellants there too. I forget what they were called. And then you had another group. They called themselves the Skoptsi. Actually, other people called them that. They called themselves something else. And they went further than the flagellants. The men would castrate themselves, and the women would cut off their nipples, or sometimes do entire mastectomies, or otherwise damage their vaginas. And all this was done with no anesthetics. I mean, this is the kind of guilt-ridden thing you saw in the medieval Catholic society. So I'm quite familiar with it. What's amazing today is that the left in this country, the progressive left, and even our highest institutions are pursuing these same goals of self-flagellation. Our fault, our most grievous fault. We are racist. We are sexist. We are homophobic. And they're announcing it publicly. As an example, I just retired from East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. Over the summer, before I retired, the Faculty Senate sent out a letter to the faculty, and to everyone, really, announcing that East Carolina University has been a racist institution since it was founded in 1909. And as far as I know, I haven't seen anything. At no point has the administration of a university come out and said, no, that's not really true. Now, of course, East Carolina University is, it's not a big name university outside of a local area, so nobody really pays much attention to it. But if you look around the country, you'll see other universities that are doing the same thing, taking statues down, renaming buildings, all in the name of combating racism. And one of the biggest names to do it recently is Princeton University. This is the letter from the president of Princeton University, Eisgruber, on the university's efforts to combat systemic racism. And he goes on here, this is dated, you can see, September the 2nd, 2020. And he goes on talking about things, and he goes on and how, Princeton was racist in the past. But he says that, racist assumptions from the past also remain embedded in the structures of the university itself. Princeton inherits from earlier generations at least 9 departments and programs organized around European languages and culture, but only a single relatively small program in African studies. This summer's efforts to address systemic racism began with changes and initiatives that we announced in June. And he goes on to talk about what some of those initiatives were. So here you have a president of a major university, an Ivy League university, one of the oldest in the United States, announcing that his institution has been and remains racist. Has been and remains racist. Systemically racist. And they need to address this. Now, this takes me back to the earlier issue I raised in the introduction. If the KKK set up a university and publicly announced that it was a racist institution, would we continue to fund it? So this raises the obvious question. If these institutions like Princeton or my old institution, East Carolina University, are indeed racist, should they still be funded? Interesting question. And apparently somebody at the Department of Education also started to ask it. Perhaps Betsy DeVos, perhaps somebody else. But there's a real problem here, because here you have an institution whose president publicly addresses the issue and states for the record that his institution is racist, suffering from systemic racism. And let me quote this. According to a letter the Department of Education sent to Princeton that was obtained by the Washington Examiner, such an admission from Eisgruber, the president, raises concerns that Princeton has been receiving tens of millions of dollars of federal funds in violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which declares that, quote, this is the law in this country, no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So this raises the obvious question. If Princeton is indeed racist, if Princeton is an institution troubled by systemic racism and perhaps, structural racism, maybe even invisible racism. If Princeton is that kind of institution, should it still be receiving, not at the whim of the Trump administration, but under what's written in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, federal financial assistance? And one would seem to think that the obvious question would be no. One could argue the same would be true of East Carolina University, my former institution. Should they continue to get federal funds, since the chair of the Faculty Senate has come out publicly and announced that the university is now and always has been, going back to its founding in 1909, a racist institution? Why would we fund these racist institutions? We wouldn't fund KKK University. We wouldn't fund the American Nazi University if they were self-avowed racists. So why are we going to fund universities that come out publicly and say, we are racist? Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Are they ready to move from the beating their chest, showing their wokeness, showing their, social sensitivities? Or are they willing to go further like the flagellants and literally beat their backs till they start to bleed? Because that's really the question they're facing here. How far do they want to put this guilt trip? How far do they want to pursue it? This is an interesting piece in the City Journal from New York by Seth Barron. If any of you watch Tucker Carlson's show, you've seen Mr. Barron on occasion. And he quotes here one of the university response. It is unfortunate that the Department of Education appears to believe that grappling honestly with the nation's history and the current effects of systemic racism runs afoul of existing law. In other words, Barron says, yes, of course we are racist, but not that kind of racist. The problem is the law doesn't discriminate between one kind of racism and another. It says that if you are racist and you're guilty of racism, you shouldn't get federal money. And they've come out and they said that they're racist. And as he puts it, and I think he puts it very well, the DOE has called Princeton's bluff on the question of systemic racism, and not a moment too soon. The entire country has been forced to listen for months now as a parade of elite institutions, universities, banks, media outlets, a national political party, entire professions issue laments about systemic American racism and their own complicity in the perpetuation of whiteness. This orgy of recrimination is patently insincere. Does anyone believe these people or imagine that their contrition is real? Of course not. Who do you accuse? You accuse yourself, the French say. Who accuses oneself, excuses oneself. The whole rigmarole is a self-justifying performance by whites for an audience of like-minded other whites, beatified souls who have achieved a state of grace. They stand in opposition to bad whites who refuse to apologize for their privilege. And down here, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, or whoever in the DOA, decided to initiate the investigation, because they are investigating Princeton and probably other institutions, has executed a jiu-jitsu maneuver with the potential to neutralize the entire systemic racism narrative. If racism is institutionally embedded somewhere, the United States is a juggernaut of laws, courts, investigators, and prosecutors that can tear the offending institution into shreds and pulverize its racism. This isn't 1955 anymore. So bring out your systemic racism, Princeton. Let's see it, because if it isn't documented or identifiable somewhere, or if it lurks below the level of consciousness or implicit bias, like it's invisible racism, then it's like, I can't even pronounce this word, or ether, and just a form of juju or magical thinking. As for the latter, Eisgruber has been leading Princeton since 2013. Has he just become aware of the systemic racism that he claims is shot through his entire institution? If he only noticed it now, he must have been blind. If he knew it was there all along, then he has been unethical. Either way, shouldn't he be fired? For too long, false confessions of racial piety have been used as a cudgel to intimidate reasonable people and transform American institutions. The Trump administration is right to take the systemic racists at their word and make their contrition cost them something. And I think that's the whole point of this exercise. If you're going to come out and declare that you're racist, then you should be treated like a racist institution under our existing laws, which were passed to prevent racist institutions from operating in that fashion. If my old university, East Carolina University, has been racist since 1909, isn't it time for the federal government to get involved and shake that place down, shake it up? Let's find just where the racism is in that institution. Let's find just where the systemic racism is at Princeton and other elite institutions that are talking about their own racism now. They're calling their bluff. Ante up, accept the fact you're racist, look the other way. Don't take federal funds. How can you take federal funds to support a racist activity? It's not like they're, Princeton's going to clear the whole thing up and get rid of systemic racism in one semester. Nothing happens that quickly. So they've really got themselves in a bind here. And of course, what they really, I guess, need to hope is that Joe Biden becomes president next year, because if he doesn't and this continues, they're either going to have to back up and say, well, we're not really racist, or they're going to have to, live by the law, which is aimed at racist institutions as they claim to be. So let me know what you think. Are you involved with an institution that suddenly discovered that it's a racist institution? That's, beating itself, self-flagellating, or beating itself on its chest and saying, may a racist, may a Maxim a racist? Let me know. Share your own experiences about this question. And if you like the video, push that button, give it a thumbs up, share the video with your friends, hit the notification button so you know when I post new videos. And until the next time, stand firm, face the resistance, and keep fighting.